Hello, and welcome to The Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, we're going to talk about something that often gets a little bit overlooked in both traditional and even our alternative relationships. What happens when the agreement you started with no longer fits the life you're living now? Now, first, as always, I want to thank all of you for being here, whether you're listening from the US, Australia, Spain, Canada, South America, or anywhere in between. I'm really grateful for all of your support, your questions, your shares, the DMs, the discussions that this show continues to spark. Every week, this audience grows, and that means something to me. You're not just listeners. You're part of this ongoing conversation around kink and psychology and what it means to build honest relationships. So if you're finding value in the podcast and you want to help support the work, there is a donation link in the profile, right, in my show's description. There's no pressure, but if the show has helped you think differently, feel seen, or navigate something hard, any contribution helps me keep producing the content that isn't just a surface level noise. Now, with that said, let's talk about relationships, because the truth is most people enter relationships with a quiet belief that if something's right, it's just going to work. You love each other. Maybe you move in, you get married, you're negotiating a dynamic, whatever the structure is. And in those early stages, it feels locked in. It feels just right. But no one really tells you that what fits at 25 might not fit at 35 or 40. What felt aligned when you first committed might now feel constrictive or even irrelevant. Life does change. We change as people, and yet so many people never go back to the table and really update their terms. That's what today's show and this episode is about, renegotiation. Not because something's broken, not because someone did something wrong, but because growth without communication leads to disconnection. And we're going to get into why this matters, how to do it, and what it reveals, sometimes about the relationship and sometimes about yourself. So let's get into this. First, I want to say this. Love isn't static, and neither are you. And there's this lie most people buy into, whether they're monogamous or kinky, poly, or somewhere in between, that the lie is simple. If the relationship is right, it shouldn't need work. You meet someone, you fall in love, you set your agreements. Maybe it's the collar, maybe it's a wedding ring, maybe it's just a shared understanding. And from here, the story goes that things should just fall into place, that if you really care about each other, the structure you built together will hold indefinitely. That's not love. That's romantic mythology. It's fantasy. It's comfort culture. Real relationships, the ones that go the distance, don't just survive off chemistry or compatibility. They last because the people inside of them know how to adapt, because they're willing to step back and say, wait, is this still working for the both of us? And this is where renegotiation becomes necessary. Let's define it really clearly. Renegotiation is the active process of revisiting your relationship agreements and emotional expectations, not because something's broken, but because something has changed. It is an intentional conversation, sometimes several, about the emotional and practical frameworks that hold the relationship together. You're not relitigating the past. You're not doing anything. You're not dwelling on previous conversations. You're updating your contract. You're saying, I've changed, you've changed, and our lives have changed. So what do we need now? And if you're not doing this, you're likely living off of old terms, old roles, old assumptions. And those things don't really age well. Now, here's what most couples, vanilla or lifestyle, don't realize until it's too late. You can't build a future off yesterday's agreements. What happens in long-term relationships is that people quietly default to what I call maintenance by silence. That's where everything looks fine on the surface. There's no major fights. There's no really a visible rupture. So you assume you're good. But under the surface, one person is accommodating, the other is assuming. Both are drifting. People stop checking in because nothing feels urgent. They stop asking deeper questions because things are okay. But okay isn't intimacy, it's inertia. And by the time you're only talking because something snapped, you're already behind the eight ball. This isn't just a vanilla marriage problem. I see it, constantly in the lifestyle dynamics. Submissives afraid to speak up because they don't want to disturb a protocol they outgrew 6 years ago. Dominants holding on to a structure because it worked once and they don't want to admit it doesn't fit anymore. Both partners quietly mourning a dynamic they don't know how to update. But here's the thing, you're supposed to change. That's the point of life. Growth isn't a threat. It's evidence that you're still alive. If you're the same person today as you were when you entered the relationship, chances are you're either not growing or you're shrinking to preserve something that no longer reflects who you are. And let's be honest here, a lot of people are staying in roles they agreed to out of survival, not sovereignty. Out of fear of disruption, not desire for alignment. Out of loyalty to a past version of themselves. But a relationship can't thrive if people inside of it are performing outdated scripts, right? And no dynamic, kinky, vanilla, sexual, or romantic, can survive on nostalgia. You can love someone and still need to change the way you relate to each other. You can honor your history and still rewrite the structure. You can be deeply committed and still realize that the contract needs updating. The challenge is this, though. If you never pause to reassess the terms, you might be maintaining a relationship that no longer exists in any meaningful way. You're just keeping the shell intact. And I get it, this stuff's really uncomfortable. Renegotiation brings uncertainty. It forces honesty. It requires both partners to show up with the courage and humility. But the alternative is quieter and far more corrosive. It's emotional detachment masked instability, and it's decades of going through the motions, wondering when the last real connection happened. So this is where we begin. Not with conflict, not with collapse, but with a question. Are we still who we said we'd be to each other? And if not, what are we willing to become together now? And this is where I want to get a little bit into the whole of the psychology of relational evolution. And I want to go a little bit deeper here. Let's talk about what's really happening under the hood when relationships start to feel misaligned and why renegotiation isn't just a good idea, but a psychological necessity. Because look, we're not just talking about preferences here. We're talking about developmental truth. Human beings evolve over time. Roles shift, priorities move. Your sense of identity matures, sometimes dramatically. And if your relationship isn't adapting with the evolution, then pressure builds, often quietly at first, until something cracks. So let's walk through the frameworks that explain this. You don't need to be a therapist to understand these things. You just need to have lived long enough to realize that love doesn't cut if the structure can't flex, right? You're not going to survive it just because we're in love and it's, there's nothing that's going to, no, it doesn't really work that way. So the first thing I want to look at is what we call life cycle theory here. And this says that human relationships go through predictable stages tied to major life transitions, young adulthood, career shifts, marriage, or even a long-term partnership, becoming parents, or choosing not to, launching adult children, retirement, aging, death. Every one of these stages introduces a new stressor, new responsibilities, and new identities. When you first got together, maybe you just needed time or sex or shared values or that late night connection. Now maybe one of you is a caregiver for an aging parent. Maybe you are recovering from burnout. Maybe one of you is navigating chronic illness or menopause or even a spiritual change. And yet, despite all of these major shifts, we expect the relationship to stay the same. That's where the breakdown starts. If the structure of the relationship, how you communicate, how you care for each other, how you make your decisions, doesn't evolve with the life you staged or that you're now in, the pressure starts to build. One partner starts carrying more than they can handle. The other feels shut out. Resentment starts to grow quietly. And I just recently spoke about resentment inside of relationships, right? There was a few episodes ago. If you need to understand that more, take a listen to that, right? But here, suddenly you're fighting about tone or socks or scheduling, but the real issue isn't that your relationship is still built for a life you're no longer living. And this applies across the board, vanilla couples and lifestyle couples alike. I've worked with DS pairs who built their dynamic pre-kids and never revised it. 5 years later, one partner is in parent mode, the other feels sexually disconnected, and they're both are silently confused why their ritual check-ins feel totally empty. It's not a failure, that's an untended evolution. Now, this next part is what we call differentiation, and this one's a big one. The concept of differentiation is the ability to hold on to yourself and your sense of who you are while staying emotionally connected to the other person. That means you're allowed to grow, you're allowed to change, challenge ideas, pursue new passions, maybe evolve spiritually without it being seen as a threat to the relationship. Poorly differentiated couples panic when someone changes. This whole mindset becomes, if you want something new, that must mean I'm not enough. Or if you're growing, it must mean you're leaving. That's emotional fusion, not intimacy. And in well-differentiated relationships, change here isn't an attack. It's expected. Partners see each other as the dynamic begins, not fixed roles. So when renegotiation happens, it's not treated as betrayal. It's treated as maturity. It says, I want to stay connected to who you are now, not just who you were. This is especially critical in our kink dynamics. If your submissive partner starts expressing new needs or personal growth, your reaction is to clamp down tighter to preserve maybe control. That's not dominance, that's insecurity. And that's the same thing in vanilla marriages. If your partner starts exploring a new part of their identity or wants to revisit their emotional labor balance in the home, your first reaction maybe is defensiveness, right? You're not protecting the relationship, you're avoiding your own discomfort. Renegotiation requires differentiation. If you can't hold on to yourself while your partner grows, the relationship starts to suffocate. One or both of you will start self-abandoning just to keep things smooth until the smoothness turns into silence. And this is where we now have to look at the whole part of relational maintenance. And this is pretty straightforward, but often ignored. Now, what research shows is this: healthy, lasting relationships are not the result of, passion or fate or great sex. They are a result of consistent, proactive upkeep. Couples who regularly check in, express appreciation, adjust expectations, and communicate even when things seem fine are the ones who definitely last. Most people only start doing maintenance when something breaks, but the strongest relationships are the ones where partners say, hey, feels like we've changed a little bit. Want to sit down and talk about what we need now? That kind of check-in doesn't come from drama, it comes from a discipline, it comes from respect. And this is something lifestyle couples actually should have an advantage with, because DS culture is built on intentional communication. But even there, people get lazy. Rituals become performative, check-ins get rushed. Nobody wants to rock the boat until the boat is already sinking. Renegotiation isn't just about advanced maintenance, it's the oil change. It's the structural inspection here. You don't wait for the engine light to come on, you do it because the relationship matters enough to keep it running well. And now I want to talk about attachment, because how we feel about renegotiation is shaped by how we attached. In secure functioning relationships, partners expect and accept that change will happen. They trust that they can, ask for something new or say, hey, this isn't working anymore without it blowing up the relationship. But in anxious or avoidant relationships, renegotiation feels dangerous. The anxious partner may think if I say or want something different, they're going to leave me. And the avoidant one thinks if you ask for something new, you're trying to control me. So both avoid the conversation. One stays silent to preserve safety, the other withdraws to preserve autonomy. Neither gets what's needed. And let me be blunt about this. If you can't bring in new truths into the relationship without triggering fear or control, you're not in a secure bond. You're in a performance loop, and you're managing each other, not relating to each other. Renegotiation becomes possible when the thread of truth, is greater than the desire for connection. Which brings us back to this. Whether you're married with 3 kids or in a 24/7 dynamic with a collar and contract, you're still a human. And humans change, roles change, desires shift, bodies age, and energy moves. So the real question isn't, is our structure still intact? It's, does the structure still serve the people inside of it? Because whether your dynamic is built on chore charts or collar protocols, you still have an emotional contract. And like any contract that's meant to last, it needs to be revised. Not reactively when something collapses, but intentionally, because you care enough to keep the connection honest. And this is going to take me to this next part. This emotional contract that was never actually signed, right? Because a lot of people don't even know they're living inside of an emotional contract. Every relationship has one. It doesn't matter if you're legally married, collar bound, you're nesting, you're poly, you're monogamous, or you're still trying to figure out what the hell you are. The emotional contract is always there. It's the unspoken agreement that forms in every long-term connection. The roles you step into, the expectations you absorb, and the things you silently agree to do or be without ever writing them down or speaking them aloud. Now, not everybody really plans it in that way. It just happens. Early in a relationship, it's all projection and adrenaline. You're both high on chemicals. You're mirroring each other. You're trying to impress each other, trying to secure that connection. It feels electric, but it also is built on assumption. You take mental notes. You build a relational map here from the first 100 interactions. You plan the first few dates, so I guess you're the one who handles logistics. I opened up about my trauma and you comforted me, so I guess you're the emotional anchor now. I topped more when we started, but I saw how much you liked bottoming, so I pulled back. None of that is official, but over time it solidifies, and before you know it, the emotional contract has been signed, without discussion, without clarity, and often without consent. Now, some of that works. Roles can be helpful. Patterns give us a rhythm. But here's the problem with all of that. Emotional contracts don't account for growth. They're built on a version of you that doesn't exist anymore. The needs you had at 27 aren't the needs you have at 40. The dynamic that worked before the baby or the burnout or the breakdown might not hold now. But if the emotional contract hasn't been revisited, what ends up happening is quiet performance. Keep showing up as the version of yourself that your partner expects, even if that version feels like a costume. And sometimes you're not even doing it for them anymore. You're doing it to avoid conflict, to protect the myth of harmony, to not rock the boat, to not hear, you've changed. But of course you've changed. You're supposed to. And let me give you some examples of emotional contracts I've seen people trapped in. I'm the one who keeps the peace. They're the dreamer. I'm the stable one. I'm the one who says yes. They need me to stay submissive, even though I've outgrown the version of submission I started with. We agreed I wouldn't talk about that part of myself. I stopped asking for what I wanted sexually because I didn't want them to feel inadequate. These aren't small things. They are patterns that shape our lives, and over time they build resentment, not because someone did something wrong, but because the structure froze and the people inside of it kept growing. You can love your partner and still feel suffocated by a role you didn't know you were playing. And that's the thing people miss. Emotional contracts expire, not because love ends, not because the connection isn't real, but because the terms were written by a version of you that no longer exists. And that's not betrayal, that's not instability, that's not losing the magic, that's growth. The question really is, do you have the courage to admit it? Do you have the language to say, I know this is how I've always been, but it's not how I want to keep going? Do you have the kind of relationship where the truth can land without it being seen as rejection? If not, you're not in a safe relationship, you're in a managed one, because here's the real truth of all of this. Every relationship has a silent agreement running in the background, but the healthiest ones don't leave it silent forever. They bring it into the light. They update their terms. They make sure that both people are still consenting, not just to the love, but to the structure that holds it. That's not a disruption. That's maintenance. And that's not a loss. That's clarity. And clarity is where intimacy actually begins. And now that we've talked about renegotiation and emotional contracts and why so many couples get stuck, it's time to talk about what to actually do about it. And here's the tool I've been using with some of my clients. It's simple, but it's not easy. And if you take it seriously, it can change how you relate, not just in a crisis, but as a regular practice to keep your connection honest and alive. It's called the 3-need check-in, and here's how it works. Each partner writes down 3 things they currently need from the relationship right now, not 5 years ago, not someday, not when the kids are older or we have more time. Right now, in this season, as the person you are today, what do you need? These aren't vague things, I want more love or just better communication. They need to be specific and grounded and personal. Things like, I need more autonomy around my time. I need to feel desired again, not just loved, but wanted. I need us to stop defaulting to me for emotional labor. I need to feel like my submission still matters even though I'm in mom mode 80% of the day. I need space to question how I identify sexually without it threatening our bond. This isn't about judgment, it's about clarity. And here's the whole step-by-step process. First, write your 3. Do it privately. Don't edit it for tone or politeness. Don't try to make it sound good for your partner. This is about honesty, not harmony. What do you need from this relationship right now to feel grounded, seen, and fulfilled? Next, you share them with each other. You read them aloud. You don't jump into the discussion right away, and you let them land. You let your partner hear you and hear themselves without reacting. This moment alone can be really powerful and transformative because often what's shared has never been said out loud before, not because it was hidden, but because no one ever made the space for it. And finally, you scrub the old stuff. Look at what's no longer relevant. The agreements you made that were based off different season of life, the things you've been doing out of inertia, not intention. Ask, are we still living by this rule because it serves us or because we're afraid to change it? Is this dynamic still alive, or are we performing it out of obligation? And do either one of us feel like we're stuck in a role that no longer fits? Get rid of anything that's expired, assumed, or performative. You don't need to destroy your relationship. You just need to let go of the pieces that no longer reflect your current reality. Finally, you need to come back to the table. And this is where the renegotiation actually starts. Not from panic, not from conflict, but from presence. You've named your needs. You cleared the dead wood. You look at each other and ask, what does alignment look like now? What are we building going forward? Now, this isn't a one-time exercise. This is the beginning of a new chapter one of you can come back to as life continues to shift. So why does this work? Because it forces articulation. It stops you from living in assumption. It gives you a language for what's been living quietly under the surface. And most of all, it interrupts the pattern of waiting for things to break before you address them. And it gives you a tool that isn't about rupture, it's about rhythm. You don't need to throw the whole relationship out. You don't need to start over. You just need to adjust the foundation so it still fits the people living inside of it. And let's talk about dynamics. For my listeners that are into lifestyle, this tool's very critical because here's what I see all the time, especially in DS, is a relationship gets negotiated early. Everyone feels empowered and inspired. And then 5 years later, one person's needs have shifted, but the structure hasn't. Protocols have become a routine. Rituals feel mechanical. Intimacy becomes silent. The 3-need check-in brings you back to intentionality. It lets the submissive say, here's what I need from this dynamic now. It lets the dominant say, this is where I feel disconnected, and here's how I want to re-engage. It gives both partners a way to realign without framing it as some sort of failure. And for vanilla couples out there, this is how you break out of autopilot. It's how you stop performing roles you quietly resent. It's how you stop relying on history to carry a relationship that isn't being nourished in the present. Too many people stay in a kind of quiet emotional debt, giving, compromising, adjusting, because the cost of speaking up feels too high. But the truth is, the longer you avoid clarity, the more expensive it gets. This tool gives you a way to get back into the relationship with both eyes open. You're not just asking, do you still love me? You're asking, what does it look like for us to thrive now? And that's where things get honest. And that's where the real work begins. And this is why renegotiation reveals the difference. Because here's the part that most people don't want to face. Sometimes when you finally come to the table, when you do the work and you speak your needs and strip away all of those outdated things, you're not just met with relief. You're met with distance, not drama, not dysfunction, just a quiet realization that the person across from you has grown in a different direction. And that's not a failure, it's not a flaw in the relationship, it's just divergence. And it happens more often than people like to admit. Now, one of you might want children now and the other still doesn't. One of you might be feeling a powerful pull towards kink or wanting to recenter the dominance and submission in your life, while the other one is craving peace and privacy, maybe even detachments from the roles entirely. Maybe one of you wants something new, adventure, going back to school, stimulation, new erotic territory, and the other person is barely holding it together under the weight of the fatigue and emotional burnout. None of these things are betrayal, but they are inflection points. They're signals that your lives that were once aligned may now be running on different tracks. And this is the truth behind renegotiation. It doesn't always bring you back together. Sometimes it gives you something more important than comfort. It gives you clarity. And from that clarity, you can make a final decision with both feet on the ground. You stop performing closeness. You stop bending to avoid conflict. You start asking the real question, can we meet each other here in this version of ourselves, or are we walking through different chapters? But divergence isn't always separation. Sometimes naming your needs, really naming your needs, is what finally brings you back to one another. Because for some couples, the distance wasn't caused by incompatibility, it was caused by silence. Assumptions, unspoken rules, emotional autopilot. When all of these things get stripped away, you're left with two people finally telling the truth about what matters to them now. Something remarkable can happen. The relationship doesn't end, it evolves. And I've seen couples who were on the brink of burnout realign completely, not because they returned to who they were, but because they made room for who they are. They rebuilt the relationship with eyes wide open. They didn't try to go back to some golden age. They let themselves build something in the present, something mutual, something that reflects the real people in the room today. And what came out of that wasn't just stronger, it was chosen, it was deliberate, and it was free of performance. And that's the other side of renegotiation. It's not just about crisis response. It's a reconnection tool. It opens a door, not always to the past, but sometimes to a future you didn't even know was possible until you said the hard things out loud. And that type of reconnection doesn't just happen by accident. It takes honesty and a willingness to sit in that discomfort of hearing things you might not like at first. It requires both people to choose curiosity over control and courage over comfort. And when it happens, that kind of repair is profound. It's not just about getting back on the same page. It's writing a new chapter altogether. Other times, the most loving thing you can do is just let go, not in rage, not in regret, but with the quiet strength that comes from saying, we've reached the natural conclusion of what we've built. And I want us both to be free to keep moving, even if that means separately. And I say this a lot, and I mean it here just as much. Clarity is always better than performance. Pretending to be aligned when you're not, doesn't keep love alive. It delays the fallout. And when you've built your entire dynamic vanilla or lifestyle on roles that no longer reflect who you are, you're not in a relationship anymore. You're in a routine, and routine without honesty, that's just spiritual erosion. So if renegotiation brings you truth that's hard, you got to respect it. If it brings you truth that reconnects you, you honor that too. Let it lead you somewhere real, even if it's where you never thought you'd go. Because the truth here, even when it hurts, will always serve you more than that silence. And truth, when it brings you closer, has the power to renew what you thought was lost. You got to understand, relationships here are living, evolving systems. They can't thrive on old promises or outdated roles or silence disguised as peace. They need presence. They need adjustment. They need attunement. They need people who are willing to ask hard questions, not just of each other, but of themselves. We don't renegotiate because we failed. We renegotiate because we've grown. Because the version of love we started with was built by two people we no longer fully are. That's not a tragedy, it's an opportunity. And there's something honest, something intimate about turning to your partner and saying, this is who I am now. Are you still willing to meet me here? That's not a threat. That's love in motion. So as you step back into your own life, whether you are partnered or solo, kinky or vanilla, long-term or just beginning, take a moment and ask yourself this. What do I actually need right now? And does it shape my relationship to reflect that? Or is it just an echo of who I used to be? If the answer's hard, don't run from it. Don't dress it up. Sit with it. Because the longer you pretend that everything's fine, the more disconnected you become. From them and from yourself. The truth won't always be easy here. But it will always give you something through that performance never can. A starting point. And whether that starting point brings you closer or calls for change, at least that you know you're moving forward in truth, not stuck in silence. And I know this is a very heavy topic. And I know that there are going to be some comments here about advocating for change, or people are going to think that I'm saying you need to break up. I'm not saying these things. You need to just be honest with yourself, because I have seen people involved in relationships and the other partner is just left behind, and eventually that rift is so big they can no longer honor it. But they weren't being honest with what themselves or what their partner wanted or what they wanted, so they just sat until it just ruptured. And then there was no saving it. And then it's years trying to figure out who they were, what they did wrong, right? This helps with all of that. Even, like I said, if the trust or the truth here for you isn't necessarily what you expected. And it can be scary. But we don't just have to think of the negative side of it. We can think of the positivity that comes out of it. What if we find that we both have been thinking these things and we were afraid to say it because of what it might do, but in the end, it makes us stronger. We can rebuild and re-strengthen and fortify our relationship so it moves forward into the next chapter it's meant to be, right? There's a lot more that can come out of this that's positive than negative. I know taking a chance and being honest in relationships can be scary, but that's the whole reason we're inside of them. And if you avoid that, if you dismiss it, you're not being honest with yourself or the person you first entered into it with. It's a lot to think about. So let me know your thoughts and your comments on this today. I know this is a big subject. If you've experienced renegotiation or this is your first time hearing about it, let me know what you think, right? I'm loving the questions that I'm starting to get. Yes, I'm going to get to some of these future shows. I still do have some interviews coming out. I was just recently on Authentically Kinky. I don't know when that's coming out yet. When it does come out, I will drop the notice on my socials so you can all have that. That way you can have a listen and learn a little bit more, at least on some more of my views, whatever they may be. It was a really good interview. I'm going to try to bring Hi There Catsuit over to the Kink Perspective here in the near future. It's another interview I've got to get scheduled. But keep your comments coming in and keep your questions coming in. Some of them are going to inspire some more shows, and other ones I'm going to try to answer privately because they are a little bit more private. But I do appreciate that. All of you new people coming in, can I say hi to you all? I can't. So it's going to be easier for me just to say hello, Europe, and the new countries. I'll name a few: Croatia, Finland. God, I love you up in Finland. You were all very adamant that I send a shout out, so here it is to you. Argentina, Brazil, thank you for listening and tuning in and your questions and about your private searches for who you are and not changing identity. I'm happy for you because that's what it's about, living life authentically. I do have a book. It's not the greatest book on the planet. Tangled Desires, the exploration of BDSM, or psychology in BDSM. First book out there, Chris was a little bit repetitive, but you know what? That's what happens when you self-publish, and you don't get it right the first time, but that's okay, right? It does teach you a little bit of something. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written it. I do have a couple other things coming out. I've got some more writings that I'm still doing. If you're not, you don't follow, if you're not on Fetlife, which is one of my major socials, or you don't follow me on Instagram, which is The King Perspective, you can find me there. I do drop a lot of things there, or I'm not really big on X. I'm on there, but I just kind of post and then leave. I don't really do a lot. But I'm also on Substack, enhanced-mind.com. You can find me there, right? Do a lot of my writings. So if you don't want to be on a kinky website, you can still find a lot of my stuff on Substack. And we go from there, right? So let me know what you thought about today's episode, what's kind of resonating in your mind with this, where this is going. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.